Hi everybody, thank you for purchasing this tutorial. What I want to do with this one is I have noticed a lot of people messaging me saying they'd like to know my workflow as far as lighting and color composition in UE4. And particularly in the experience I've had with teaching students in workshop and boot camp scenarios, they always seem to get a little bit daunted when it comes to the lighting and rendering workflow in Unreal Engine. And there's a lot of documentation out there to cover all the principles of UE4's lighting, all the technological leaps they're doing for it recently with the new releases they have to the engine. But I kind of wanted to make a tutorial that just established sort of the basic meat and potatoes of whenever I go and set up a scene, what lighting run through I'm going to do. And I'm going to be try it a little bit different this time, where instead of doing a very elaborate, complicated scene, I have a very simple tool set right here that I'm going to set up and have the lighting essentially carry all the different scenarios as I work through it. So the first thing I'm going to show here is I just am going to set up a base material that will carry the lighting. So right now I just have a completely empty black void scene. There's absolutely nothing in this UE4 scene, and I always like to start out that way. And so if you just go File, New Level, Empty Level, you can get this black scene here. And then I already created this material, but it's as simple as just right-clicking, going to Material, and then I'm going to name it Basic Color underscore Master. And what I'm going to do here is start going through some of the basic properties of the material that catches the light and how it's going to affect it. So I'm going to hold down 3 and click to get a constant 3 vector. And then I'm going to right click and do Make Parameter. And I'm going to name this parameter Base Tint. And then I'm going to change the base color value to 0.5 or 50% gray. So this is the hue, the saturation, and the value. So this is a 50% gray right in the middle between black and white. And then I'm going to plug this into the base color here, and this is going to be the base albedo diffuse of the color that you can see here. So that's one principle, obviously, is the local color and what that's going to affect when the light is interacting with it. There's one other, or actually there's 2 other very important values that I'm going to put down here, and that's the reflective properties of the material and how it's going to how it's going to reflect the light and absorb the light in a way. So there's specular and there's roughness. So I'm going to hold down 1 and create 2 constant 1 vectors and just do convert to parameter on the first and call this just simply spec. I'm going to set this value at, I believe the default is 0.5, so I'll do 0.5 for this. Plug that into the specular. And then this one I'm going to do rough. I'm going to put this at, I'm going to keep this at 0.1 as my default. Let me see what the default is here. So yeah, I think 0.1 for a default of roughness is what I'll start with here. And then also, if you're using any man-made metallic surfaces, I'm going to do one that's metallic and set that default value of 0 just because we want to have that completely off for metallic, and plug that in. Now you can see with rough already on this material right here, that's a pretty glossy, almost like a shiny new plastic material, so I'm going to actually kick this back up to 0.9. And you'll see that that shininess is going to go away. Now if I save this and compile it and create a material instance from this, I'll be able to change this in real time without having to wait for it to compile, as you're seeing here. So this will be sort of the base master material that I'm going to be putting on all the base meshes that I'll be setting up in the scene to see how the lighting plays off of it. And so I'm going to start here. I just have this basic mountain base mesh here that I just created kind of out of World Machine. It doesn't even really have a material set to it. It's just kind of a nice World Machine created piece of terrain that I have here. But this is a nice sort of base piece to go off of. So I'm going to bring it in, and I'm going to actually scale the Z form of this down a bit, just so there's kind of a more flat plane element to it. And I'm going to scale this at 200 by 200 for the X and Y. And so what I'm doing here is I'm essentially creating a horizon line to know where the camera or eye is in location when it comes to where the perspective grid is going to go. So if I think the grid is, I can still see it if there's a wireframe. Yes, you can see the grid right here and the perspective grids that go back in space here. So I might actually get this a little closer to the grid just so we can get a bit of a better relationship going there. So there's essentially my horizon line that's broken up a little bit by a distant version of a mountain range there. And so I'm going to go with lit, and you can see this is still completely dark because there's no lighting information in here at all. And also what I'm going to do is create a material instance from this true color master. I'm going to just assign this here. So if I go to unlit, you can see this is a basic gray base color. And then also in the buffer visualization, there's all these buffer visualizers that can show you the values that the material is doing in the scene, which is extremely nice. So if I go for the roughness, one thing to just keep in mind with the basics is completely white is completely matte or non-shiny. Completely black is very shiny, almost like something has been completely covered with water or oil or something like that. So if I turn on these parameters here and I start playing around with these values, you can see the values are starting to change there. And this can apply to the roughness. This can also apply to specular and metallic as well. So I'm going to go back to unlit, or actually I'm going to go back to lit. And then I'm going to do two main scenes. One, a large exterior scene to simulate large outdoor spaces, and also a interior scene to simulate enclosed, interesting sort of interior spaces and what they might be doing. So the first light I always drop down is the directional light, which will obviously represent the sun. And I'm going to set that to movable. I also want to cover both dynamic movable lighting and static or stationary baked lighting and what that indicates. So if you're doing something that requires changes in times of day or changes in where the position of the sun is, you're going to have to do a movable or dynamic light. If you have a set scene where the sun is never going to move its position, it can change its intensity and it can change its light color. That's what a stationary setting is for. So just setting up here, movable is totally dynamic. We have dynamic shadows, ray trace shadows, everything for like open world, dynamic, movable times of day. Stationary is the sun has to stay completely still in its rotation or position, but and you can excuse me, the benefit of this is you can have baked lighting and baked global illumination, which always looks really nice. And you can also modify the intensity, the light color, the volumetric scattering intensity, I believe. And I think those are the three main ones, but those are nice options to have. Static is nothing can change once the lighting is baked. This is a lot cheaper than stationary. That's why they have these two options here. But usually when I do baked lighting, I go for stationary, at least with the sunlight. So I've dropped down the directional light of the sunlight. First thing I'm going to do is set the intensity to 1 instead of 10, just to keep everything with a basic sense of making sense mathematically, where the intensity of 0 to 1 for the light, for the sunlight, you want that to be clamped at a value of 1 or less. And now you can see here the gray is being illuminated by the form shadows being cast here. You can see as I move this around, the form shadows are changing. And as I move it down, and I can click off the snap to rotation here, you can see the form shadows and the cast shadows starting to creep across this landscape here. This is whenever I'm laying down landscape composition or forms of lighting, you really want to make sure the relationship between the light and the shadow is creating very interesting shapes. Think Frank Miller comics or any other noir sort of comic aspects where they essentially build their entire composition of the characters and the landscapes with light and shadow. And you want to have the same kind of principle here. Another thing I'll be doing is I don't usually mess with light shafts too much. I make sure that, let me see here. The cascade shadow maps are turned on. One thing I'm going to do is make sure that mesh distance fields is turned on. It's a really great feature that is carried now in UE4. So I'm going to go to the project settings under Edit, go to Rendering, and then I'm going to just search Mesh Distance Fields. Generate Mesh Distance Fields. So I'm going to turn on Generate Mesh Distance Fields and make sure there's not a save button at the bottom here, and it says Restart Now to apply the new settings. Then I'm going to go to the content here and do Exterior Lighting 01. Then really quick, just wait for it to restart here. But the reason ray traced shadows was not checked on is it requires mesh distance fields to activate that. And one thing about the directional light or sunlight is that like the sunlight, you need to really monitor the softness of the shadows as they cast across the landscape. You don't want extremely sharp shadows being cast on things like foliage or characters or anything like that. There's a lot of complicated kind of elements it comes to when it comes to the actual rays of the sun being diffused and casting their shadows on the ground. So if I go back down to here, I'm going to turn on Ray Trace Distance Field Shadows. I'm also going to go to this mountain mesh that I have here, and I'm going to go down to Generate Mesh Distance Fields, and then I'm going to look for the resolution that the Mesh Distance Fields has as soon as I find it here. Let's see. Here we go. Distance field resolution scale. I'm going to switch that to 100. I'm going to do two-sided distance field generation because this is just a flat plane. It's not enclosed. It's only has one set of normals on one side, so I want to make sure that this checkbox is checked on. You want to do this for foliage and anything like a large piece of terrain that doesn't have a bottom side to it. If it's an enclosed mesh like a prop or any other model that's completely enclosed, you don't have to worry about this as much. I'm going to just do apply changes here and just save it. And so that'll help get a better, softer resolution here. Another thing I'm going to do is in here, I'm going to add a little bit of noise breakup. I just added a simple tiling, just rock texture that I made. And I want to use this to just add a little bit of realistic detail to the mesh that I'm doing here. So it's just not a very smooth CG generated looking mountain here. So I'm doing normal tile, default value at 1. I'm going to plug that into the normal map here. And so you can see now there's an actual sort of realistic depiction of sort of that crunchy, realistic form that's going across the landscape here. So you get all those little bit of micro details in the form that you can see there. So right now, with just this directional light and this mesh here, it looks kind of like the surface of the moon. And that's actually a very accurate depiction of when it comes to things in space. All the really beautiful compositions you see with lighting in our world is all due to the fact that we live in this very complicated atmosphere that holds light, bounces light, reflects light from the atmosphere, from everything. If you look at an object in space, the actual science is that the rays are casting, bouncing off, and there's nothing to grab or bounce back. So a lot of these shadows remain completely black, devoid of any kind of bounce light. Not entirely. Some rays of bounce light will be able to bounce back up here, but that's not being depicted here because there is no bounce light photon data being implemented here. And so what needs to be implemented in order to simulate that bounce light? So one thing we're going to need with that is atmosphere, because right now it's just a black void that no atmosphere is really being generated. So what I'm going to do is go to Visual Effects, and I'm going to grab Exponential Height Fog. There is also Atmospheric Fog, and I'll just do a little bit of a demo on that really quickly. So once I drop in the Atmospheric Fog, I'm going to also go to back to the Directional Light, and I'm going to do Atmospheric Fog Sunlight, which will link the two together, which is really nice. And so you can see now this atmospheric fog is working in accordance with the direction of the sun, which is a very nice feature. And now the atmospheric fog itself, I don't use too terribly much. It is a very nice feature to have when you're doing changes in times of day, but it's not so much a and this might change in the later versions of UE4, but you can either do atmospheric fog or exponential height fog. If you try to do the two together, you will run into some Z-fighting problems with the render buffer. And so what atmospheric fog will do is it will multiply elements of the sun, like so. It'll multiply the elements of the fog. It will, if you turn down the scale distance, it will bring the effects of the fog closer and closer to the actual mesh that you can see here. And why this is red is that it is capturing everything below the horizon line. So if I modify the altitude scale here, or actually let me see here, or the ground offset, I'm sorry. If I multiply the ground offset, I'm pushing the atmospherics of the horizon line down further, so you can see more of the blue of the sky is starting to show through there. And this is starting to mimic the actual atmosphere of the blue sky that we have here on Earth that sort of helps bring the atmospheric perspective if you're looking at a distant mountain range or something like that. Now, this is starting to look a little bit better where you can clearly see a sense of atmospheric perspective where the darker values here are way darker than what's back there, but there's still a really big problem, which is that there's no atmospheric ambient light that's capturing this blue sky and projecting it into the shadowed areas. So in order to solve that, I just need to take in a skylight and drop it in like so. And what that immediately did that you can see is it's capturing a cube map, essentially. It takes a cube map render of the entire atmosphere and then uses that as an ambient map to apply to any areas in shadow, light and shadow, I believe. Right now this is set stationary, so a skylight will use the mesh distance fields to generate really nice ambient occlusion, so if I set it to movable. There wasn't much of a difference there because the mesh is so simple, but in the later interior scene you'll really see how that starts to work. And so, and one other element is that you can see these values are still extremely white, again, like it's the surface of the moon. So one thing I'm going to do here is go in and bring down the local color. And also I'm going to decrease the specular value. Because you can see if I increase the specular value, it's really starting to absorb the elements of the sunlight, kind of like a sponge. It soaks up and sort of radiates the values of the light there. And the same with the roughness too. If you can see, there's more of a reflective element going into the surface and how it's capturing the light based on these two values here, the spec and the roughness. So I might turn the spec down just a little bit. If I turn this completely black, where there's no local color, you can see the only thing happening now is the specular values and the roughness values are being picked up by the light of the sun, because the local color is as black as pitch or tar or soot, where there's absolutely no local color that's emphasizing the value of the light. If I were to have this be completely white, it's like powder or flour or something like that, where the light is only adding to the very bright local color. So if you do something kind of in between, you can see now that you have sort of that less bright contrast element to it. But also keep in mind, these values in the dark here, because the local value is so dark, it's going to be very, very black right there. So I'm going to put this back to sort of a darkish gray. And another thing I'm going to do too is I also brought in a sort of a RGBA map with that dirt pebbles texture that I had. And what I wanted to do here was sort of show the complexity that you can get with a roughness map, applying different black and white values to the roughness value and the spec value that we have here. So what I'm going to do is hold down L to create a linear interpolate. And let me show you this texture really quick, what exactly is going on here. So this is one of those maps that's condensed into multiple different channels. And so this here, you can see different black and white values that indicate darker values and lighter values for the roughness map. So what I'm going to do in the material here is I put down a linear interpolate. I'm going to channel the red into here. I'm going to detach this. I'm going to, instead of call this rough, I'm going to call it rough high. And then I'm going to duplicate it and call it rough low. I'm going to set this default value at 0.1 and keep the rough high at 0.9. And so I'm going to plug rough high into A, rough low into B. I'm going to plug that into the roughness channel here. And another thing I'm going to do too is I'm going to type minus to get a 1 minus, which is essentially inverting the values here. I'm going to duplicate the linear interpolate here. I'm going to call this spec high. Duplicate this, call it spec low. Then I'm going to plug this in here. I'm going to plug that into the specular. And so when I compile this, you can see there'll be a little bit more of an interesting, complicated relationship with the roughness and specularity going across the surface here, as you can see. So if I go to the buffer visualization and go to the roughness, you can see here. Another thing I'll do as well is also plug this tiling texture into the UVs there, just so we can get a higher res value of what's going on. Or essentially the roughness mask is sharing the same coordinates as this normal map right here. And so you can see here, these roughness values are creating some very interesting elements going on here. So I'm just going to play with the sliders so you get, an extreme sense of darkness and an extreme sense of light. So you can see interesting patterns like differences in the rock. This is a really great way to create like puddles, rivers, things like that. I try to keep my roughness values pretty isolated, meaning there's a kind of nice distinction between very matte or very light roughness values and very low roughness values. I'm going to make sure in the specular too that, yeah, there's kind of this nice, you kind of want the opposite effect where it's kind of a nice consistent gray that doesn't get too crazy with its values there. So something like this kind of creates some nice, and you can see as I play with the sliders, you can help isolate and understand what is happening with the roughness values here. And again, because this is dynamic, I can just switch the sun around. I can create this really nice cast shadow shape here, and you can see the soft shadows sort of playing off of each other there. I can bring it all the way down. You can see that the reflection values are reflecting the atmosphere here. I can take it like Death Valley style and just have it shining from straight up, which is almost never a, unless you're doing a distinct desert kind of scene, it's not really a lighting scheme that usually works very well. But you can see the flexibility of just how quickly you can start setting down this kind of landscape composition here. And going back to the atmospheric fog, I can do things like help multiply the brightness of the sun here. And another thing, of course, I can do too is just work with the local color, not just in a grayscale, but also bring it to a just simple color scale. Something like that that's a little more interesting, like so. And so now that's one way that I do it with the atmospheric fog, but one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the skylight. I'm going to delete the atmospheric fog, and I want to show the other way that I really like using, which is the exponential height fog. I'm going to drag and drop that in. And one thing I'm going to do too is there's been some really amazing strides in the volumetric fog generation for UE4, so I'm going to check that on. And then I'm going to start playing a little bit with the fog density and the fog height fall off. Now the fog height fall off. If you want something that represents a little bit more like what we had before, the bright desert, you're going to have to increase this value and play with the local color here. If you want something like a foggy overcast sky, you just crank this all the way down to a value of 0.001, and you can see this is a very nice kind of overcast ambient kind of lighting here. And another thing too that you can see is that the intensity of the sun has kind of gone down a bit because the brightness of the height fog is starting to affect the overall brightness that you're seeing down here. So what that is auto exposure working with the different values. So if I go back and put in another skylight now, you can see it's a very more kind of ambient overcast sort of lighting scheme that's going on. And I'll turn this to movable, and you can see that this is a very more kind of atmospheric sort of overcast sort of desert scene that's going on here, which can be pretty cool. Gonna change this local color back to something a little less orange here. And the other thing that's really cool with this fog is that I can turn the fog density up to something like this or 0.5, and you can see the fog elements are starting to really sort of happen or roll in. And another thing that is really cool too is the volumetric scattering intensity with different kinds of light is a really interesting factor too. So if the sun is affecting the volumetric fog, you can see as I play with this slider, it's catching the rays of the sun and influencing them. So if I turn this up to something crazy like 20, you can see there's a very dominant sense of volumetric rays. And what's really cool is you can see these actual literal rays of light being cast across the volumetric fog here, which is a very cool cinematic effect that you can get here. So you can play with this you could really have a lot of fun with this for hours, where it's just like you're trying to get these really interesting ray casts of light as the high volumetric fog is capturing the rays of the sun and emphasizing it in that way. So you can get some really cool atmospheric effects with this. So if I turn this back to 1 and I go to the skylight and emphasize the volumetric scattering intensity, it's kind of like emphasizing or building on the density of the atmospheric fog as well. So this is like a very kind of rainy, foggy sort of atmosphere that you have here. And then you can also play with the intensity scale of the actual skylight itself to get different results that you might want too. One final thing that I want to do is go back to visual effects and create a accurate reflection capture of the scene here. One thing I'm going to do just really quick is I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to completely flatten it. So I'm going to turn the Z value to 0.01. And then I'm going to really quick just create a water material. And what that's going to entail is I'm just going to put a value of 0 in the base color, a value of 1 in the specular, and a value of 0.1 in the roughness. And this is essentially going to create a very still water or mirror kind of effect. And what this will be important for is understand the elements of reflection and how it's going to work. So I'm going to take this. And there's actually some artifacts going on there because the actual mesh itself is kind of, let me see if I put this at 0, what'll happen. There we go. Yeah, I might just bring in a plane. Or let me actually just search in the starter content really quick here. Yeah, glass window, that'll work. So you can see here, what this is essentially doing is capturing the screen-based reflections of the environment here. And to get a more accurate depiction of what's going on here exactly is I'm going to drag in a sphere reflection capture. And what this is a cube map that essentially captures the data of the environment, lays down a cube map, and then plugs that back into any reflective surface in order to indicate this is the environment that the reflection should be capturing. And so usually with these reflection sphere captures, I have a hierarchy. So I have one that captures the entire global scene. And then you might need one that's a little bit more accurate that you would turn the radius down for something like a cave or a certain crevice that has a specific environment around it that you'd want to reflect. So let me go back out to the content here. I'm going to drag in one of these rocks that I made. I'm going to just attach the basic material here. And this is just sort of a lumpy collection of rocks just to get a different sort of sense of form going on here. And so you'd want something a little more accurate that this sphere reflection capture is capturing here. So something such as that. And so as far as thick sort of fog atmospherics that are going on here, one last thing that's really nice is if I turn this down to something like 0.5 or 0.2, really kind of dim the intensity of the sunlight, and then hit recapture, which will recapture the environment. Then if I turn this back to 1, it'll get a more accurate sense of what's going on with the skylight going on here. Another thing I can do as well is turn down the local color of the fog. Then if I recapture the skylight there, you should have, let me see here, let me recapture the reflections here as well. What I'm trying to simulate here is sort of a more dark, there we go, a more dark sort of twilight sort of scene here. So I could turn this down even to 0.1 or something like that, or 0.05. Then with the skylight, I'll recapture that to get something a little more. Then I might put this up to 0.5. Another thing too is just fine-tuning the values of your two main lights. The trick or the technique that always works is you really want to make sure you don't overcomplicate your lighting, especially in exterior scenes. So you want to keep it isolated usually to a directional light, an exponent height fog, and a skylight. Just to make sure that you don't lose track of too many things that are going on here. So I'm going to increase the fog intensity to 1.5. I might, let's see here. Might change the skylight color to something a little more foreboding, like blue or something like that. And I might also turn down the colors a little bit too to get an interesting local color. So one last thing I'll do to show is with these point lights, you can create very atmospheric elements if I change it to movable, if I turn down the radius. And you can see here this really nice sort of glow going on outside the point light here. So if I turn this down to like 2, just create a fiery sort of color right there. And then I increase the volumetric scattering color. You can get this really nice sort of atmospheric glow going on there that you can populate in different parts. So this is really fantastic for creating mood. Just turn this down a little bit more. And I'll turn down the radius a bit too. But you can see here the creation of mood is very easy. And you can see with this atmospheric glowing effect, you can get all kinds of really cool results with this. Now, creating mood is really cool, but if you want to do something a little more like capturing the real beauty of a bright sunny day, something like that, what I'm going to do is sort of clear the palette, again, because it's such an easy I'll keep the directional light just because it's relatively easy to maintain. But I'm going to go back, create a new exponential height fog, turn on volumetric fog again. Then I might just increase the intensity of the blue here, and then play with the height fog fall off to get a more accurate depiction of a blue sunny day. You go back to the skylight, turn on movable, and you can see the really nice distance field based ambient occlusion that is set up there. And I might just play around a little bit with twirling this around to just see what kind of shadow shape reflections I can get here. So something like that's kind of nice. Might get rid of this guy really quick. And so you can see from a dynamic perspective, this is a fairly, let me just also, for the sake of creating some interest here, just increasing the warm tone color palette of the sunlight there, which will be really nice. And this will have to do more with composition of what you want your mountains and landscape elements to do. But for this, you can see just how simple it is to set up a very nice daylight lighting scenario as long as you keep it simple to these three elements here. And I really haven't messed around too much with any of the sliders here. Just a little bit of the height fog fall off, the local color, checking on the volumetric fog, and maybe playing with the fog density just a little bit. So you have this bright morning, and then I can also play around with, again, the fog density with the sunlight here. Just swing it around. Usually morning or afternoon, you get these really nice form shadows and cast shadows going on, which is always really nice. And again, another factor that will really help with the color elements of this is playing around with the local color of the actual piece itself. So let me just really quick create another material instance so I can have a different local color going on here. Something that is maybe just a little more interesting like that. So I'll make these have this color, and then I'll make these have this color here. So let me change the base tint here. Yeah, there we go. So you can see local color is a huge influence of setting up an interesting color composition, as well as tweaking a little bit and you can see you don't really need too much. Like if you really want to emphasize a very warm color palette, you can go, but you really need a light touch as far as just indicating a sense of a warm sunlight and a cool skylight. And so this is good for dynamic, but if you want to get something like baked bounce lighting, like some really nice desert implementations of, we set up a scenario where the sunlight is really bouncing intensely off of here. And let me just bend the rules a little bit and increase this a bit. And also on this, I'm going to turn down or turn up the rough lowness just to make these just a little more matte and not as glossy there. So let me set up a scenario where the sun would be setting in and bouncing off here, but it's still a little bit dark, and there's no sense of bounce light really illuminating these areas of shadow. And so there's two ways you can do this. One, you could actually literally just go in with spotlights and fake the bounce light in a way, which sometimes I actually do in my scenes because it gives me, one, it gives me complete control. Two, it saves a lot of time because there is a huge downside, which is that baking lighting takes a lot of processing time. And if you have a very complicated scene, it's going to take a lot of time to render those. And if any errors crop up or anything like that, there's going to be a lot of troubleshooting going on. So one thing that you can always do is, if you look at the relative intensity of the primary light and then look at the bounce light, you can think of an analogy of photons coming from a source of light as water coming out of a garden hose and hitting a surface, and you get that splash when the water hits a surface, like a rock or something like that, where the main stream that's coming from the garden hose is going to be obviously very intense. It's going to be the strongest sense of water hitting a surface. The splashback that you get when it hits the first surface is going to be the secondary bounce, and then that's going to be essentially this bounce light here. So I'm going to put it down to like 0.5 or something like that. So you can see that little bit of bounce light going there. And then if you need to do a third bounce, it's going to be twice as or extremely more weak and lower than that. So that's going to be something like 0.1 or 0.25, something like that. And even then, that might be asking for a lot, so maybe 0.05. So you can see you're sort of starting to illuminate this sense of faking bounce light that I'm setting up here by having these different spotlights sort of lining up perpendicular, or essentially if the photons come in this way, it's like a billiard ball hitting a border where the photons will bounce off the opposite trajectory of the photons and the angle that they have. So think like billiard balls bouncing off surfaces and stuff like that. That's kind of another analogy to think of. So with that, but if you don't want to do that, if you want to set up very accurate static baked lighting, which I think if you're doing a final scene for a portfolio piece or something, I think is definitely worth doing. What we need to first look at getting into baked lighting is to make sure that all of our meshes have the necessary elements to even do baked lighting. So what you'll need to do, and another thing before I set off with more baked lighting, I just brought in this simple tree branch, and I set up a very simple tree branch material because I wanted to bring in some element of foliage here. So it's not just flat rock stuff, but also an element of foliage and how it exactly behaves and works and all that. So I'll just be setting those up a little bit here so you can see the accurate depiction of what's going on with a foliage set here. I'm going to turn on two-sided just so you don't get these weird ghosts or ghost branches just floating there. And really quick, just with going through this material, I just literally have the alpha cut out, the normal map, and I'm just very quickly going to, well actually, I'm just going to copy paste all the factors that I have set up here. So base tint, metallic, rough high, spec high. Just going to take all those and just plug them into here. Okay, there we go. So you can see now the gray, there's a local color of gray going on here for the basic color master, or my apologies, the foliage master. So I'm just going to turn that down a bit, or create something kind of relatively green, so we kind of have an accurate depiction here. I'm also going to mess a little bit with the spec high and rough high. So going back to baked lighting, one thing that is very important is you need a set of UVs that can take the light map data and project it back on once the light bake is done. So what that means is that you need a set of light map UVs with your mesh. Luckily, UE4 will be able to generate a light map UV channel for you when you import the mesh, and it's usually pretty accurate. If you have a mesh that doesn't have any overlapping UVs whatsoever, like this mountain right here, you don't really need to worry about your light map UVs too bad, because it's just going to be projecting onto this flat UV space the same way the texture would be doing that. Same goes for this rock right here, where it's just going to be taking the same, flat UV space that you have here and generating it the same way you would a texture. Now, the problem though is that if you have a modular system, like say a bunch of tree branches that are sharing the same texture, because you can see here, all these UVs are overlapping each other because they're trying to capture the same plant or branch texture like 20, 30 times. And so what you need to do is have another second UV channel where no UVs are lapping whatsoever, because all these UV islands need to capture their own light map data. And so all you need to do is when you import any kind of mesh and bring it in, you just need to turn on generate light map UVs, and that's really all you need to do. Now if you need very specific elements, usually UE4 will generate a pretty good light map for you. So especially for organic materials. But you can also go into Maya and generate the second UV channel yourself if you really need to. And another thing you need to do is go through these settings here. The general settings, make sure that the light map resolution is something pretty accurate. Like I think 512 is usually a good setting. The light map coordinate index is set to the UV channel of 1. So the UV channel of 0 is the one that's overlapping, and the UV channel of 1 is not. So you just want to make sure that this light map coordinate index is set to this channel, and then applying that. The other thing I will do too, just for safety, is I'm going to go to under LOD 0 and do source light map index and just hit 1 there too as well, just to make sure everything is really good to go. Because one error you might be getting is that even though you have the light map channel generated, the light map UVs might not be referencing the right light map channel, which will give you errors saying it's it has overlapping UVs and is just not set up to the right channel. And I'll just go through and make sure that's the same case with here. So source light map index, light map coordinate, destination light map index is set at a channel of 1. And then light map coordinate index is set at a channel of 1. The light map resolution is about 1024 because this is a fairly large mesh here. I'm going to go to the last one here, this mountain. The light map resolution, I'm going to set this to about 512. And then light map coordinate index. Again, because there's only one UV channel and it's a very flat laid out, no overlapping element, I think that's okay. So I'll go ahead and just save this. And so now these meshes should be good to go for a light map bake. Now, one thing we'll do, the first step with actually in the engine is I'm going to take a light mass importance volume and drop it into the scene. Everything inside this bounding box is going to get accurate light map data when it bakes. So I'm just going to make sure that it only captures the elements of the scene that I want to. I'm not going to create a really giant box that just goes out to crazy dimensions or anything like that, because that would be a waste of processing power. So I'm just going to make sure it just stays within this scene that I want to see here. The other thing I'm going to do is just really quick, I'm going to create the, just to see the global illumination effect, I'm going to make this a very distinct, almost turquoise green, just so you can see the light map photon bounce that's going on here. So the light mass bounding box is set up. The UVs on the meshes should be good to go, and we can test that once that's all set to go. One last thing we'll do is go into the light mass settings, under world settings. I'm going to check a few boxes and change a few elements here. So I'm going to do number indirect lighting bounces. I'm going to increase that to 5. I'm going to do use ambient occlusion, generate ambient occlusion materials, and then I'm going to, going to set that back there. I believe that is the only two options I'm going to do here. The defaults set here are pretty good to go, I believe. So one other thing too, once that's all good to go, so once I did a couple little check go for flight things in here, I have the light mass importance volume in here. All the meshes are good to go. I'm going to do one last thing, and that's I'm going to go to volumes. I'm going to drag in a post-processing volume. I'm not going to worry about the scale of this, but what I am going to do is go down to post-process volume settings, and I'm going to check on infinite extent unbound. What that's going to say is that this post-process volume is just going to affect the entire scene, no matter what. So that's a very important box to check because it essentially turns it on. And then I'm going to go up to rendering features, go to global illumination. I'm going to check these two on. And this is going to essentially turn on the global illumination that we will generate with this light map bake. So we're almost go for flight. One last thing is I'm going to go under build, go to lighting quality, and I'm going to do high. I never do production because it takes a very, very long time and I don't really see too much of a difference. You can do medium. It's a little harder to see what the accurate light bake is going to be, and preview is too low quality to really see what is going on. So I usually just go for high. And so now I'm just going to do build lighting only. And so it's going to gather scene geometry, and it's also going to try to connect to a swarm node that I have set up in my project. And it'll export the lighting data. Because there's only a couple objects in here, it shouldn't take too long. If you have a massive scene with a lot of foliage and stuff like that, it could literally take hours. And one thing I want to talk about is that if you have any foliage in your scene, say if you're painting lots of grass or lots of flowers or anything like that, one very important thing that you need to do to save your rendering time is go down to the instance settings and change these to movable. Even if you want an accurate light baking scene, the light probes that you set up in here will give enough of an accurate depiction that it will generate accurate lighting for whatever grass or plants that you have. Because if you have thousands of instances of foliage in here, it's really not worth it to have it set to static and allows baked lighting to integrate with it, from my experience. Just because there's just thousands and thousands of these, the light map accuracy of these is just not going to really gel too much. So I find it's way cleaner and way more less of a headache to just set these all to movable when you have lots of instance foliage in your scene. And so you can see a little bit, it's looking a little bit good. And to see the extreme effect of this, what I'm going to do is go down to global illumination. I'm going to crank this to 50. And you can see that nothing has really happened. So let me, this is a very important part of, oh, I missed one step in the OK Go flight, and that is that I did not change these light sources back to stationary. So part of the checklist with this is everything I set up here, and also I need to set this back to stationary, and it'll say lighting needs to be rebuilt, 9 unbuilt objects. I'll set this to stationary as well. Any dynamic lights that you have in your scene, you want to set to stationary or static. And now I'm going to build lighting only. So that was one last checkbox that I didn't do when I set out to build this. So one last thing there. So we'll rebuild the lighting again and get a more accurate depiction this time, I believe. Yeah, there's a lot of steps to set up, but a really nice, accurate light bake scenario is going to be a really important thing, or a really nice feature to have with your scene. It's either that, or I'm having a complete, almost light rig set up to get the bounce lighting doing exactly what you need it to do. But either or, I think, is important to learn when working in any game engine. And you can see the preview text here is another indication that lighting needs to be baked here. Another thing with building lighting, also recapture the reflection sphere captures that I have set up here, which is another nice feature it'll do.